Henry Lawson, a famous restaurant owner, discovers an abuse of power in his own restaurant and decides to step up to change the company culture, helping employees break free from the control of a toxic manager, while restoring power and respect for those who had been oppressed. These are stories I have witnessed with the names of those involved, changed to protect their identities. I don't want to tell them like cold news reports, but as real fragments of life that carry simple yet profound lessons. Never underestimate anyone because of the color of their skin. Before we begin, tell me, what time is it where you are? And where in the world are you watching from? Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your story. In the heart of New York City, there's a charming yet sophisticated bistro called the Savory Grove, owned by none other than Henry Lawson, a renowned Hollywood actor. Unlike many celebrity-run businesses, Henry didn't treat this as a vanity project. It was a genuine passion for him, a place where people from all walks of life could gather and enjoy exceptional food in a warm, welcoming atmosphere. Henry had spent years perfecting his culinary offerings and ensuring that his team of chefs and waitstaff were as exceptional as the meals they served. But even in a place that appeared to run smoothly, Henry knew better than to believe the glossy surface. There were stories hidden behind the kitchen doors, whispers in the staff break room, and silent exhaustion in the eyes of the employees after long shifts. He knew that success wasn't just measured by the customers dining at the tables, but by how the people working behind the scenes were treated. And so, Henry made it a habit to visit the Savory Grove as a regular customer, blending in with the crowd and experiencing his bistro through the eyes of those who worked there. The evening rush was in full swing at the Savory Grove, the soft hum of conversations and clinking silverware filling the air. Henry, dressed casually in a hoodie and jeans, walked through the door without fanfare, just like any other diner. As he made his way through the crowded restaurant, he couldn't help but notice a subtle tension in the atmosphere. Servers dashed between tables with trays of sizzling dishes, but there was something in the air that felt off. Henry's sharp eyes soon landed on the manager, a tall man named Ryan Calloway, who stood at the edge of the room with his arms crossed, his gaze scanning the space with a sharpness that made people uneasy. It wasn't just the way he observed, but how controlling his posture felt. Henry, having spent years in the industry, knew that appearances could be deceiving, and his instincts told him something wasn't right. He continued walking toward the bar, but as he passed a narrow hallway near the kitchen, he heard an unmistakable sound, a quiet sob, muffled but full of pain. Henry's steps slowed. His curiosity piqued. He turned his head toward the break room door, slightly ajar. Inside, he saw a young woman, her head bowed and hands gripping the edge of a metal counter, her body trembling. Another employee, a young man named Leo, stood beside her, speaking in hushed tones, trying to comfort her. Henry didn't know the woman, but the look on her face hit him hard. It was the kind of look that told him something was terribly wrong. Without hesitation, he made up his mind he wasn't leaving until he figured out what was happening in his own restaurant. Henry's heart raced as he listened to the conversation between the young woman, Emily, and her co-worker, Leo. He could barely make out the words, but the fragments that reached his ears sent a chill down his spine. "You can't let him. He doesn't own you," Leo said urgently, his voice trembling. Emily, her voice barely audible, responded, "What choice do I have? He made it clear if I don't do what he says, I'm gone." Henry's grip tightened around the glass of water in front of him as he processed the information. This wasn't just stress or exhaustion. This was fear, pure and simple. He had worked in restaurants long enough to know the signs. Rude customers, long shifts, and physical exhaustion were part of the job. But this was different. This was about someone using their power to control another person. Henry's mind raced, trying to piece it all together. He initially thought it might be about a customer. Perhaps someone had harassed her. But as Emily's words lingered in his mind, he realized this wasn't about a customer at all. This was about someone inside the restaurant. He glanced toward Ryan Calloway, the manager, still standing near the host station, his arms crossed. Scanning the room, Henry's instincts told him that Calloway was at the center of it all. He needed to know more, without drawing attention to himself. Henry casually got up from his seat and walked toward the back of the restaurant, where Leo had stepped out from the break room. Henry approached him at the server station and asked for a pen, keeping his tone light as Leo handed it to him. Henry's mind worked quickly. "Hey, Leo, is everything okay with Emily?" he asked. Keeping his voice low, Leo stiffened, his hands tightening around a stack of plates. "She's fine," he said too quickly, but the tension in his voice was palpable. Henry wasn't convinced. "She doesn't look fine," he said, studying Leo's reaction. After a long pause, Leo exhaled and admitted in a whisper, "She's not fine." Henry's gut clenched. This wasn't just a bad work environment, this was something far worse. Leo was clearly hesitant to speak, but Henry could see that the young man wanted to share the truth. "Is it a customer issue?" Henry asked, lowering his voice even more. Leo hesitated before shaking his head. "No," he replied, glancing nervously toward Calloway. "It's not a customer." Henry's heart sank. The problem wasn't external, it was within his own restaurant. "It's her personal business," Leo finally said, his voice tight. Henry knew that wasn't the whole truth, but he also knew that Leo was afraid to speak out. The weight of the situation hung heavily in the air. Henry wasn't going to leave without understanding what was going on. But he also knew that confronting Calloway directly might not be the right move just yet. He needed more information, and he needed to approach this carefully. Henry took a slow breath, his mind racing as he observed the situation. He had seen enough to know that something was deeply wrong. It wasn't just the manager, Ryan Calloway, who had the unmistakable air of someone used to wielding power with impunity. It was the entire culture of the restaurant. Henry had spent years in the restaurant industry, and while he had always been aware of the pressure that came with long hours and demanding customers, this was different. He could see it in this way Emily, Leo, and the other employees carried themselves. There was a palpable fear, a sense of being trapped. This wasn't just a toxic work environment. It was a system of control, where the employees had no voice, no choice, and no power. Henry's initial instinct had been to confront Calloway directly, but as he stood there watching, he realized that it wasn't enough to simply remove the one problem. The entire dynamic needed to change. The employees were too afraid to speak up, too afraid to challenge the status quo. Henry knew that if he was going to make a difference, he couldn't just fix this isolated issue. He needed to address the broader culture of fear and silence that had taken root in his restaurant. He couldn't change the system overnight, but he could start by giving Emily and the others the chance to speak without fear of repercussions. Henry's resolve hardened. He was no longer just a concerned owner. He was a man on a mission to bring real change to the people who worked under him. The weight of responsibility was heavy, but he knew it was his job to lead by example. It wasn't enough to be a good boss when no one else was watching. He needed to be the kind of leader who created an environment where people felt safe, respected, and heard. And so, Henry decided that he wasn't going to wait any longer. He would take action now, not only for Emily, but for every other employee who had been silenced by fear. The time for change had come, and it started with him standing up to the very person who had been perpetuating the toxic atmosphere. The first step was confronting Ryan Calloway and making sure that his reign of control was over. But that was just the beginning. Henry understood now that the real battle wasn't just with one person. It was with the entire system that allowed abuses of power to thrive, unchecked. Henry didn't waste any time. As soon as he made the decision, he knew exactly what he had to do. Walking back into the restaurant with renewed determination, he headed straight toward Emily. The restaurant was quieter now, the dinner rush winding down, but the tension in the air was still thick. Emily was at the bar, organizing some plates, her usual professional composure intact. But there was something in her eyes, fear, uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Henry approached her slowly, his presence commanding but gentle. "Emily, we need to talk," he said softly, making sure she knew he wasn't just another boss throwing demands at her. At first, she hesitated, looking like she might back away. But there was something in Henry's voice that made her stop. She gave him a nervous nod and followed him away from the bar. "Is everything all right?" Henry asked. Keeping his tone even, Emily looked at him, her face pale. And for a moment, she seemed to fight with herself, as if deciding whether or not to open up. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her apron. Henry's heart went out to her. He could see how trapped she felt. This wasn't just about a manager being harsh. It was about fear, intimidation, and manipulation. Henry lowered his voice, his gaze soft but firm. "I know what's been going on. Emily, you don't have to say anything if you're not ready. But I want you to know something: you're not alone." Her eyes flickered with confusion. But there was a flicker of something else there, too, a glimmer of hope. She took a shaky breath and tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Henry stepped closer, his resolve strengthening. "Listen to me. You don't have to keep putting up with this. You can leave. And you will. You're not trapped here anymore." Emily's face twisted with uncertainty, her lips trembling as she tried to process his words. "But I can't just leave," she murmured, her voice cracking. "I don't have a choice." Henry reached out, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "You do have a choice," he said quietly, locking eyes with her. "And I promise you, I'll make sure you have the opportunity to make the right one." The moment between them was thick with emotion, and Henry could feel the weight of it. Emily wasn't just looking for a way out of a bad situation. She was looking for someone to believe in her, to tell her that it was okay to fight back, to stand up for herself. It was clear that she had been under Ryan Calloway's thumb for far too long. And now, for the first time in a long time, she was being offered a way out. Henry's mind raced, thinking of the next steps. He couldn't let this moment slip away. He knew that Emily wasn't the only one who needed help. The rest of the staff was just as trapped, just as fearful. And it wasn't just about giving them a safe place to work. It was about changing the whole culture of the restaurant. Henry looked around at the employees still lingering in the back of the restaurant, most of them watching the interaction with wide eyes, some still unsure of what was happening. Henry turned back to Emily. "You're safe now," he said with a quiet intensity. "I'm not going anywhere until we fix this." For the first time in what seemed like forever, Emily let out a small sigh of relief, her shoulders relaxing, the weight she had carried for so long beginning to lift. Henry knew this was just the beginning, but it was the beginning of something important. Emily had been given a voice again, and now it was time to give the rest of the staff the same. It wasn't just about confronting Ryan Calloway. It was about creating an environment where fear no longer had a hold over the people who worked there. Henry had come here to fix a problem, but he realized that he was about to do something much bigger than that. He was about to change the entire dynamic of his restaurant, and with it, the lives of everyone who worked there. As Henry stepped back from the conversation with Emily, he felt a shift within himself, a sense of clarity, a deep understanding that he had the power to make real change. This wasn't just about confronting a manager who abused his power. This was about taking responsibility for the people who trusted him with their livelihoods. For years, Henry had been focused on his career, his success, and his image. He had built an empire, but in doing so, he had overlooked the most important part of his business: the people who made it all happen. Now, standing in the midst of the staff, who had quietly endured the toxic atmosphere, he realized just how much he had taken for granted. This wasn't just about a restaurant, it was about a community. A group of individuals who had worked tirelessly to make the place run smoothly while suffering in silence. Henry's heart was heavy with the realization of how long they had been trapped under the control of someone like Ryan Calloway. But now, there was hope. Henry knew that this moment was a turning point, not just for Emily, but for everyone who had been affected. His role as a leader had taken on a new meaning. It wasn't enough to show up and smile for the cameras. It wasn't enough to sign paychecks and expect things to go smoothly. True leadership meant being there for the people you lead, listening to their concerns, and fighting for their well-being. It meant creating a safe environment where they could speak their minds without fear of retaliation. The weight of this responsibility settled heavily on Henry's shoulders, but he didn't shy away from it. In fact, he embraced it. He knew that it would take time, and it wouldn't be easy. But he was committed to the journey ahead. He wasn't just going to fix one problem. He was going to rebuild the entire culture of his restaurant. The next steps were clear. Ryan Calloway had to go. But the real work was in ensuring that no one else like him would ever take his place. The restaurant needed a fresh start, one built on respect, trust, and transparency. Henry understood now that his influence didn't just come from his fame or fortune. It came from his ability to change the lives of those around him. And as he looked at the employees, all of them still processing the events that had just unfolded, he knew that he had already begun to make a difference. They were no longer just workers in a restaurant. They were a team, a community, and together, they would rebuild not only the restaurant, but the way they viewed their own worth. Henry wasn't just an actor anymore. He was a leader, and this was his true calling. The road ahead was long, but he was ready. With a renewed sense of purpose, Henry stood tall, ready to fight for the people who had once been voiceless in a system that had failed them. As Henry stepped into the back of the restaurant, he was acutely aware of the gravity of the moment. The air was thick with tension, but it was also filled with a sense of anticipation. Emily, Tyler, Nate, and the rest of the staff were waiting for him to make the next move, waiting to see if he would follow through on his promises. Henry knew that what he was about to do would not only affect their lives, but it would set a precedent for how leadership should be. He turned to face the group, his heart pounding in his chest. "You've all been working under someone who didn't deserve his position," he began, his voice steady but firm. "That changes now." The room was quiet, but there was a sense of relief that began to spread through the employees as they processed his words. Emily wiped away a tear, her shoulders a little less hunched, her posture stronger. The weight of fear was lifting from her. And she wasn't the only one. Henry could see the shift in the room. "From this moment forward, this restaurant is under direct review," he continued. "We'll be making changes, not just replacing Calloway, but ensuring no one else like him ever gets this kind of power again." The staff exchanged glances, some unsure if they should believe it, others hopeful but cautious. Henry's gaze fell on Emily again. "You're safe now," he said gently. She looked at him, a mix of disbelief and relief in her eyes. For the first time that night, she stood a little taller, her shoulders less tense. The room was filled with a new energy, an energy of empowerment. Tyler, still in shock, spoke up. "Sir, I don't mean to overstep, but this isn't just about Calloway," he said, his voice stronger now. "The pressure, the way we're treated, the fear of speaking up. It's bigger than just this restaurant." Nate nodded in agreement, his expression more resolute. "A lot of us feel like we have no choice but to put up with it. The second we complain, we're out of a job." Emily looked down, her eyes filled with guilt. "I wanted to leave so many times," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I couldn't afford to. And I thought maybe this was normal." Henry's jaw tightened, anger rising in his chest. This wasn't just one bad manager. This was a systemic issue, one that was rooted deep in the culture of the restaurant industry. It wasn't just about Calloway. It was about a system that allowed people like him to thrive, while others suffered in silence. That stops today. Henry said firmly, his voice unwavering. The room fell into a deep silence. But there was something different about it now. The silence was no longer one of fear. It was one of hope, of anticipation, of belief that things could change. "I don't just want to fix this restaurant," Henry said, his eyes scanning the room, making sure each and every employee knew he meant what he said. "I want to fix the system, and I'll need your help to do that. That means transparency. That means trust. That means if something is wrong, you speak up." Emily still looked uncertain, but there was a glimmer of something in her eyes now, a flicker of belief. "And if we do, will anyone actually listen?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry met her eyes, his gaze steady. "I will," he said simply. Emily studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his words, and then, finally, she nodded. For the first time that night, she looked like she believed him. Henry took a deep breath as he stepped outside into the cool night air. His thoughts racing, he had taken the first step, but he knew it was just the beginning. The work ahead of him wasn't easy, and it wasn't going to be quick. But for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. Later that night, as he watched the employees lock up for the night, he saw Emily walking out with Tyler and Nate. They were talking quietly, but Henry could see it in their faces. Something had changed. They looked lighter, freer, as though the weight of the last year had been lifted from their shoulders. As Henry sat in his car, watching them leave, he realized this was more than just one restaurant, more than just one group of employees. How many others were out there, trapped in the same cycle? How many others had been afraid to speak up? How many had been overlooked because they didn't have a voice? Henry knew this was why he had started this journey in the first place, not for the fame, not for the money, but for the people. Because leadership wasn't just about control, it was about responsibility, and he was ready to take on that responsibility, not just for his business, but for everyone who had ever felt unheard or unimportant. Leadership isn't about power, Henry thought, as he watched the last of his employees disappear into the night. It's about giving people the power to change their own lives. With that thought, he knew his work was far from over. But for the first time, he felt hopeful about the future, not just for the Savory Grove, but for every place where people were ready to stand up and break the cycle. The life lesson from this experience is clear. Leadership is not about power, control, or maintaining an image. It's about responsibility, empathy, and standing up for what is right, even when it's uncomfortable. Henry Lawson's journey through his own restaurant opened his eyes to the harsh realities that many people face behind closed doors. And he learned that true success isn't just measured by profit margins or customer satisfaction. It's about the well-being of the people who make the business run. No one should ever feel trapped in a toxic environment because they fear losing their job or their livelihood. True leadership means creating a safe space where people can speak up, feel heard, and be valued for who they are, not just what they do. In the case of the Savory Grove, it wasn't enough to fix one problem. Henry had to change the entire culture to make sure no one else ever had to suffer in silence again. The real work starts when you look beyond the surface and recognize that people's lives matter more than the numbers on a balance sheet. This lesson isn't just for business owners. It's for anyone in a position of power. When you see someone struggling, don't look away. Speak up, take action, and make a difference. Real change starts with individuals who are willing to challenge the status quo and fight for what's right. In life, it's easy to get caught up in your own success. But the real measure of a person is how they treat others, especially those who have less power. And if you ever find yourself in a situation where someone is abusing their power over you or others, don't stay silent. Speak up. Sometimes, all it takes is one person to break the cycle and change everything for the better. Real-life application. If you find yourself in a situation where someone in a position of authority is mistreating others, or even you, it's important to remember that you are not alone. Find the courage to speak up, even if it's hard. Look for allies who share your concerns and stand together. When we unite and demand change, we can create a better environment for everyone. It's also important to seek out leaders who empower others, not those who seek to control them. As Henry learned, leadership is about making people feel safe, respected, and heard. If you're in a position of leadership, remember that your actions have consequences. Treat those you lead with kindness and respect, and create a culture where everyone has a voice. In the long run, this not only leads to a healthier work environment, but also to greater success for everyone involved.